It's safe to say that most Americans have never heard the name Leon Trotsky. He was a founding father of the Soviet Union, a proponent of permanent revolution, and perhaps most remarkably of all, he's an intellectual pin-up for many of the so-called neoconservatives who currently infest the Bush administration. In 1963, one of Trotsky's disciples declared that proof of the communist icon's farsightedness could be found in the fact that none of his predictions had come true. The same cannot be said of Robert Welch, who had a habit of making remarkable predictions that actually came true. Good. More than 4 decades ago, Mr. Welch warned that the long-term strategy of the power elite controlling our government was, quote, to induce the gradual surrender of American sovereignty piece by piece and step by step to various international organizations, of which the United Nations is the outstanding but far from the only example, close quote. Mr. Welch's warning was confirmed in the seminal 1974 Foreign Affairs essay, The Hard Road to World Order. Those seeking total power, wrote globalist heavyweight Richard Gardner, must recognize that, and I quote, the house of world order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down by way of an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, close quote. Millions of Americans have become incurably disenchanted with the UN, its corruption, its work in facilitating mass murder and tyranny, its unalloyed hatred for our nation and founding ideals. But few Americans, alas, have heard of the World Trade Organization, and an even smaller number recognizes the danger that the WTO represents to our prosperity and national independence. This is troubling, since the WTO poses a threat to our nation more acute than that posed by the United Nations itself. In my judgment, if we were to leave the UN and remain to the WTO, we would gain nothing. One measure of the importance the power elite assigns to the WTO is found in the 1995 manifesto, Our Global Neighborhood, the report compiled by the Commission on Global Governance. That report described the WTO as, quote, a crucial building block for global economic governance, close quote. It is through regional trade blocs such as the European Union, NAFTA, and the proposed Free Trade Area of the Americas, or FTAA, that the grand designs of global engineers will be implemented in practical terms. Many critics of the United Nations revel in the endless supply of absurdities on display in the oversized playpen called the General Assembly. Loathsome as that body is, it's something of a glorified student council. Membership, for the most part, confers a boost to the ego, but little, if any, tangible power. The real power in the UN is exercised by the Security Council and through the world body's economic appendages, the World Bank and the IMF. Now, a brief digression is necessary in order to explain the WTO's role in this global architecture. At a UN Foreign Aid conference about 10 years ago, I cornered former World Bank Commissar Barbara Conable and challenged him to explain to me the constitutional justification for foreign aid. Now, treating me with a patronizing smile, Conable explained that the Constitution authorized the United States government to maintain a military, which, as he explained it, was an instrument for the government to exercise its influence in the world. Foreign aid, he continued, serves the same purpose by inducing foreign countries to act in certain ways without the resort to military force. So what you're telling me, I remarked, is that it's a matter of either bribing them or bombing them. Treating me to another condescending sneer, Conable walked away. That encounter highlights another remarkably prescient observation by Robert Welch. In an October 1979 address, Mr. Welch predicted that the United States, quote, which once had been the most cordially admired nation on earth for so successfully minding its own business, will eventually become the most hated nation on earth for the universal practice of imperialism by the dollar as its substitute for the sword, close quote. Economist John Perkins was among the mercenaries called on to do the dirty work of what Mr. Welch called dollar imperialism. Covertly recruited by the National Security Agency in the 1960s, Perkins became what he describes as an economic hitman. In his recently published book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, Perkins describes how he would be dispatched to third world countries to help induce their governments to take out huge World Bank loans to fund development projects. If the hitman is successful, he writes, and I quote, "The loans are so large that the debtor is forced to default on its payments after a few years. When this happens, then, like the mafia, we demand our pound of flesh. This often includes one or more of the following: control over United Nations votes, the installation of military bases, or access to precious resources. Of course, the debtor still owes us money, and another country is added to our global empire." Close quote. I hasten to specify that the we to whom he refers is the global power elite. Now, economic hitmen aren't the only weapons in the power elite's arsenal. Perkins also refers to jackals, who are sent to deal with the most refractory foreign leaders by fomenting revolutions or staging assassinations. When all else fails, as Barbara Conable might put it, it's time to send out the bombers. Writes Perkins, and I quote, "When the jackals fail, young Americans are sent in to kill and die." Close quote. And parenthetically, that's not the mission most of them sign up for. In his recent book, The Pentagon's New Map, Defense Department strategist Thomas P.M. Barnett offers an unintended confirmation of that indictment. Barnett divides the world between what he calls the functioning core, that is to say, nations that have been assimilated into the UN's matrix of global governance, and the non-integrating gap, which consists of nations not yet wired into that system. According to Barnett, U.S. military strategy for the foreseeable future will be devoted to expanding the global core by conquering unassimilated nations. Of course, Barnett concedes being assimilated into the global core, quote, "does not mean bad things will never happen to you," close quote. In words eerily similar to those of John Perkins, the economic hitman whom I just quoted, Barnett blithely states, quote, "It is always possible to fall off this bandwagon called globalization, and when you do, bloodshed will follow. If you are lucky, so will American troops," close quote. What does all of this have to do with the WTO? That question is easily answered once one simple fact is understood. In the WTO, a body with the power to determine our nation's economic future, decisions are handed down on a one-country, one-vote basis with no veto mechanism. In that body, the U.S. is surrounded by delegates from nations whose economies Washington has helped destroy through the practice of dollar imperialism. And the Geneva-based WTO is already exercising the power to regulate our nation's trade, to define elements of our tax policy, and nullify economic legislation. Many nations have seen their emerging middle-class populations destroyed because of policies imposed on them by the World Bank and the IMF. The WTO is intended to have the same impact on our nation. Globally managed trade is being used to redistribute our wealth to the so-called developing world. The WTO-abetted export of our manufacturing capacity will eventually leave our nation economically neutered and militarily impotent. And since the WTO is dominated by third world delegates eager for revenge, it's easy to see how it could end with the Carthaginian destruction of the American middle class. How did we get here? As with most large-scale foreign policy betrayals, it all begins with Alger Hiss. The United Nations is sometimes referred to as the house that Hiss built in recognition of its treasonous chief architect, the Soviet spy Alger Hiss. Along with fellow Soviet mole Harry Dexter White, Hiss was instrumental in creating the constellation of global institutions, the World Bank and IMF, the UN, and the proposed Global Trade Organization, or GTO. Hiss led the U.S. delegation to the GTO's 1947 founding conference in Havana. To its credit, Congress had little enthusiasm for the Global Trade Organization. The GTO treaty was stillborn when presented to Congress for ratification in 1948. Although depicted as a charter to free world trade, commented Nevada Republican Senator George Malone several years later, the GTO pact was actually, quote, a charter for trade control, close quote. The result of its adoption, he warned, would have been socialism on a global plane. Congressional opposition to the GTO was found on both sides of the aisle. Democrat Congressman Samuel B. Pettengill of Indiana denounced the proposed global trade body as being, and I quote, part and parcel of international socialism, one worldism, and the slow surrender of American sovereignty. This is a Democrat congressman speaking. It would be part of a complex of multilateral negotiations with many nations in a sort of world super legislature where we have one vote. Once wrapped up in this spider web, it will be difficult indeed to recapture any independence of action, close quote. 2 unsuccessful attempts were made to secure congressional ratification of the GTO. For the global power elite, however, no doesn't mean no, but rather not yet. Though it took 4 decades to do it, the power elite was able to secure congressional approval of the World Trade Organization, the renamed GTO, in 1994. In 1948, patriotic Americans crossed party lines to defeat the Global Trade Organization. In December 1994, Bob Dole and Newt Gingrich, the leaders of the incoming Republican Congress, displayed an alloy of cravenness and opportunism by shepherding approval of the WTO through a special lame duck session of Congress. This was done with the specific intention of protecting the WTO from the incoming Republican Congress, which contained many freshman members leery of all global institutions and multilateral international bodies. 2 years after this betrayal, Bob Dole ran the least inspiring presidential campaign since Wendell Willkie threw the 1940 race against FDR. In Wendell Willkie's defense, he was probably on FDR's payroll at the time, so that distinguishes him somewhat from Bob Dole. By 1997, Dole was representing the side of the Chilean government in trade disputes with U.S. salmon fishermen. In testimony before the House Ways and Means Committee, House Republican leader Newt Gingrich, the incoming speaker, was commendedly candid in describing congressional approval of the WTO as nothing less than a transformational moment, a fundamental alteration in our system of government. And I quote from Mr. Gingrich, "I am just saying that we need to be honest about the fact that we are transferring from the United States at a practical level significant authority to a new organization. This is not just another trade agreement. This is adopting something which twice, once in the 1940s and once in the 1950s, the U.S. Congress rejected. I am not even saying that we should reject it. In fact, I lean toward it. But I think we have to be very careful because it is a very big transfer of power." Close quote. Mr. Gingrich, the co-engineer of that treasonous betrayal, is now a fixture on Fox News, where he regularly refreshes Sean Hannity's supply of insipid sound bites. But he's not content with the thankless chore of trying to fill Hannity's remarkably uncluttered little mind. Gingrich is thinking of making a gift of himself to the Republic by running for the presidency in 2008. Dole and Gingrich were instrumental in consummating a betrayal that was 60 years in the making. In his remarkable 1958 expose, Mainline, Senator George Malone, previously quoted, described the WTO and the United Nations as 2 arms of a pinchers movement. One arm of that pinchers was political, the steady entanglement of our nation in international alliances and multilateral bodies, particularly the United Nations, in much the same sense that Mr. Welch warned about. The other economic arm was created by the Trade Agreements Act of 1934, in which Congress ceded to the executive branch the power to control our nation's trade policy. Because of the 1934 Act, wrote Malone, quote, "The business and the enterprise of individuals now were considered in close connection to the policies of the state. The state would assist them in the expansion of their markets. Government would negotiate the channels of trade," close quote. In brief, he warned, The state would determine trade, and the President, not the Congress, would exercise that power. As Senator Malone warned more than 4 decades ago, quote, "That power is now being increasingly invested in international groups and removed from our nation's control," close quote. With the eager help of George W. Bush, that betrayal has accelerated dramatically. On several occasions, Mr. Bush has acquiesced in anti-American WTO rulings. Just weeks ago, the President proposed repealing the so-called Byrd Amendment, which imposed tariffs on subsidized goods dumped on U.S. markets by foreign governments seeking to drive American competitors out of business. It can be argued that the Byrd Amendment was economically unsound, but Mr. Bush called for its repeal in order to comply with a WTO decision last November that authorized the imposition of punitive taxes on U.S. exports by the European Union and other foreign interests, in short, taxation without representation. Shortly after last November's elections, Mr. Bush stated, and I quote, "We've worked hard to comply with the WTO. It's important that all nations comply with WTO rulings. I'll work with Congress to get into compliance," close quote. As a matter of fact, in the current administration's budget, there is a suggestion that a certain number of agricultural subsidies be removed. This also is an instance in which the U.S. government is bringing itself into compliance with WTO rulings. Not that I have a brief for the subsidies in question, but that is something that should fall under the purview of our Congress, not an unelected body in Geneva composed of foreign bureaucrats who mean us no good. The American patriots who wrested independence from the globe-straddling British Empire fought a war rather than permit the distant, unaccountable Parliament to dictate America's economic future. Yet today, the President and Congress are taking dictation from the WTO regarding our nation's tax and economic policies. This betrayal will either result in the pauperization of our country and the abolition of our independence, or it will prompt U.S. citizens to demand that our nation extricate itself from the WTO trap. Every 5 years, any member of Congress can propose a privileged resolution calling for an end to U.S. membership in the WTO. That resolution must be brought to the House floor within roughly 3 months. 5 years ago, Representative Ron Paul of Texas introduced a resolution to end U.S. WTO membership. Regrettably, it lost by a large margin. But that vote took place 5 years and the loss of several million manufacturing jobs ago. Since that vote, the WTO has begun the process of reducing our nation to feudalism, and its decisions are having palpable results. The Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to regulate trade with foreign nations. Congress has no right to delegate that power to the President, and the President certainly has no right to confer that pilfered power on a distant socialist bureaucracy made up of individuals bent on destroying our way of life. The WTO is nothing less than a suicide pact. To use the words of the prophet Isaiah, it is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. We can and must compel Congress to withdraw our nation from the WTO now. Thank you very much.